and it's really a treat because I can share some of my thoughts with the public, which is what I like to do. I'm a teacher, so that really kind of comes natural to me, and it might be also a little bit of a chance for me to even think more broadly about my own practice, so that's kind of always useful to me. So I'll talk a little bit about how I started out making the work that I make. So those of you who are familiar with my work, and I think most of you are, and I'm in my show here at St. Cloud State University. And a lot of my work, I do mixed media work, but some of my work incorporates some cast elements and hand-built elements from cast slabs. And I'll talk a little bit about how I got into doing that. So the first thing that I should say is I'm not a ceramic artist. I don't consider myself to be a ceramic artist. I consider myself to be a sculptor. So in my work, I use a lot of different kinds of materials. And I always have. And I used to do a lot of project-based, site-specific work. And I started getting into the ceramic lace work and incorporating that into my practice when I was in New York and I was teaching casting. And what happened was, well, I'll back up. When I was in undergrad, I minored in ceramics, and I really love ceramics. I mean, ceramic material is an amazing thing. I mean, obviously some of you work with ceramics or know how to work with clay. It's beautiful material. It isn't anything until you make it into something, and it responds to your body. It gives when you push on it. It gets warm when you touch it. I mean, it's pretty sexy stuff. And I minored in it, and I have to say though that as a material, when I was in school, there were a lot of rules with ceramics that I was taught. And it was, for me, kind of an intimidating material because you could work with it and then you could make something and you put it in a kiln and it could explode. And that was very daunting to me, that process, to go through all of that. But I really liked clay, and so when I got out of school, I used clay as a means to another end. I would create objects and cast them, make molds of them, and make them into other materials, whether it was plaster or bronze or wax or some other material that I would make. So start with sculpting in clay. How I got into using it was I was teaching in New York, and I was teaching casting, and I remembered that when I was in school, I had learned from my professor, Roy Strasberg, who's a wonderful ceramic artist who lives in North Carolina. He taught us how to slip cast. And I thought for my casting class, we were doing primarily bronze. And I thought, well, students aren't going to be able to do that when they get out of school. And I incorporated that into our class, which I team taught with Andy Wilhelm at Cooper Union. And I was working with slip and ceramic, and I was kind of getting into it. I mean, it was kind of a neat material. And at the time, I was doing a lot of project-based work, and I was thinking about, the human condition. I was working with projects, the ideas that were kind of related to that. But I was getting a little frustrated in my studio practice because the project-based work kind of left me, I was always, trying to solve these problems, and I was doing that kind of reacting to the situation wherever I was installing my work. And I kind of missed hunkering down and working on something long-term in the studio and developing something. So it kind of lent itself. One day I was watching a British documentary on the history of British ceramics. It was actually very entertaining. And in that, there was one art historian who was talking about how somebody had taken fabric and they had put it into the clay in a cup or something that they made. And I thought about that. I thought, you can put a material into clay and you not only make an impression, but you can actually embed it and it'll burn away. And so I just started experimenting with that as a way to make something really start taking just regular lace and dipping it in slip and putting it over some built forms or paper forms and having the paper and the lace just burn away. And then it would leave this really delicate ceramic work, but the ceramic work was too fragile to handle. It was very, 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 very difficult to manage. So I had to figure out another way of working with that. So it was kind of natural then for me to think about making a mold and casting it. So I have two ways of working. I'll make a slab mold where I can show this to you, where I cast lace. This is a miniature. This was a test piece for something I'm working on in the future. Stay tuned. But I make big, I call them my library, big molds of lace that are sheet molds with handles on them. And they're about 40 inches by 28 inches. They're pretty big. And they're a way for me to take a mold off of lace, and I pour slip then into the plaster, and the plaster absorbs the moisture out of the slip and leaves a slab of clay that I can then hand build with. And so that's kind of how I make some of my forms. So I'll come up closer so you can see. This is a form that I built out of slabs. So I have a big plaster mold that's a sheet mold. I pour the slip into it, and then I make a template, paper template usually. Sometimes I use a digital program to design it and flatten it, and then I have my template from that. And other times I just make it on my drawing table and then put it together and assemble the pieces. And I do try to match the lace so that it looks fairly seamless. So that's how these are built. Other things that I make are that you can't really build them very easily out of slab because they have curves and things like that. Those are things I make molds out of, and I'll show those in a second. Let me put it this way. Actually, I'll put this. Famous last words. Okay.
So a question came in, no firing?
Oh no, they all get fired. They all get fired. Everything gets fired twice at least. So I'm firing the earthenware to a bisque, and then I put a finish on it typically, which is usually underglaze, maybe a little bit of glaze. But I really like underglaze because I'm not really into shiny, and I also want to preserve the texture. So if you goop things up with a lot of glaze, you can kind of lose some of that texture. So typically into underglazes and stains and things like that, and then I'll fire it, and that's how I finish the work. I will also make molds. So and sometimes they get really complicated. So obviously, summer work, if you're familiar with it, has some complex curves to it. This is a little foot, stands up like this. And you can't really build this very easily out of slab. In fact, not really. I mean, you could try, but it's very difficult. So it's much easier for me to take a cast of my foot and make a plaster positive, cover it with lace, make a mold of that, cast in ceramic, and it's a very long process. It's actually kind of lunacy. And so I'm sharing this with you because I know you're not going to be able to do it because everybody's going to quit like after the first mold. You're going to be like, this sucks. I'm never doing this again. And you're like, I can just 3D print this. Yeah, okay, good. Do it. All right. So the foot is made from this mold. And you may ask, like, why do I use plaster? You cannot use I did bring a piece of a rubber mold. I'll talk about that in a minute. You can't cast slip in a rubber mold because you need the hygroscopic material. You need a material that's going to absorb water because the slip is very liquid, which I'll demonstrate in a minute. But you can see this foot mold is really very complex. So when you make a rigid mold of something with plaster, and this is something I teach in my class, the very first thing, is you can't have any undercuts. So you have to be able to get the plaster off of the positive, right? And when you have something like plaster with lace, you don't want it to lock on because your mold will break. And so it really means that you're going to make a very complex mold. And so that can be very tricky. And so if you want to do a complex object, that kind of is a big time investment. Now, my love affair with mold making comes from being able to not only transform a material, and I can also use the mold over and over again. So I can use a form in many different ways. Sometimes I use them in different sculptures. Sometimes I'll use different finishes. Sometimes I'll even modify the form. And so the mold gives me options in creating multiples, which, I guess you could say that obviously I can make some additions, which is very useful. I just sent one of my wrecking balls to Tennessee, and then I had an addition that I could show here. So, that's kind of cool. It's a little more work, but I have the mold already, so it's not like I have to reinvent the wheel every time. So the mold makes it possible for me to explore the same form in different ways. But, it is really complex, and I'll come up and show you this, and I'll pass it around. This is just the heel. So this is the mold for the foot. This is just the bottom. And I had to, because the toes are bent, I had to make little pieces that went around. So I'll pass that around if you want to see. And sometimes I will make a rubber mold for two reasons. If the thing that I'm making, if I want to have it be in another material and it's going to be something like concrete or wax, then a rubber mold is totally perfect for that. And what I did here is I'll just show this to you. I made this rubber mold. This is only half because this is the arm mold. This is the arm of the work that's in the show. This is something I created when I did a arm for Silverwood for a sculpture that I have there. It's in lace concrete. I made a ceramic version in a plaster mold that I made that also exists in some sculptures, and then I just made a rubber mold of that. So this is a mold of a thing that I cast. And what's useful about that is that sometimes plaster, because of all of the undercuts and everything, it can be a little bit more difficult to cast. Obviously concrete would probably ruin my mold. So rubber is something that stands up to concrete a little bit better and allows me a little bit more flexibility, no pun intended, but rubber is flexible. But you cannot put slip into a rubber mold. Unfortunately, that won't work. I've had students try that, I've had colleagues try that. It's never going to work. Even a press mold, some people say, well, if you use clay that's already dried a little bit and just damp, can you press it in there? And it's difficult because it won't hold its shape as well as if it is in a hydroscopic mold, which is plaster, it sucks the moisture out. So how does that work? I want to talk a little bit about putting slip in the mold and talking about slip. And slip is one of those materials. This is starting to look like my studio, a real darn mess. So let me put this stuff away. This mold, this foot mold, is, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 piece mold. So even though it's a small object, it requires, thank you, it requires a lot of pieces. So that's just something to keep in mind, that even though you're doing something small, if it has a lot of detail, that can be still a little daunting, a little difficult. And if you take care of your mold and you make your mold well enough, you can use it for, many times over. Plaster isn't going to last forever. At some point, you are going to lose some detail. The mold is going to erode a little bit. but I usually am good for, like, if I want to do 20 at least, I can do that. It really does depend on the object, and of course, how I manage it. You want to take care of your mold, so that's how that works. So, the slip that I use, I actually want to make my own slip at some point. I'm hoping to do a residency in China where I'm going to learn how to create my own porcelain. And I recognize I don't have to go all the way to China, but I want to. And learn how to make a ideal slip for the way that I work with it. I've had some slips that I've worked with that aren't very flexible or elastic. And so I want to learn more about formulas and how I can create a very elastic clay body. What I have found that works for me here in Minnesota is using Continental Clay. Has a nice porcelain body. And Minnesota Clay is a company in Plymouth, Minnesota, that has clay that they make from clay in Minnesota. Minnesota has a lot of clay. It was, I don't know, delivered unto us by the glaciers? I don't know. I don't actually know the geology. But they have a lot of clay in Minnesota. Anybody who gardens knows. And there's different clays everywhere. And the clay that I like to use, I used in my wrecking balls, is a Minnesota clay. It's from Rainy Lake. So it's a Rainy Lake stoneware. So they're not porcelain. I usually work with porcelain, but using the stoneware. And I brought a bucket of it here. This stuff up here. Brought a bucket here. Actually, this is stoneware from, well, it might be from Minnesota Clay. Anyway, I might have changed buckets, but I'm working with slip. The nice thing about slip is that you can work with it if it's set up. When I make a slab of the cast, I can work with it just like I work with a slab of clay. So that's really useful to me. And it also means that I have the ability to create objects out of a recurring pattern. So what used to stymie me a little bit was when I first started working in the lace, I would buy lace, and I lived in New York, so I would go to Mood, which is awesome. Mood, if you ever go to New York, go to Mood Fabrics. It's pretty awesome. Or check it out online. They're pretty cool. But anyway, they have this whole lace section that's really amazing. And I was buying lace, but remember I was telling you I was like dipping it in slip and I was applying it to clay bodies or applying it to paper, and the lace would burn out and I'd lose it. So I'd want to recreate a pattern and I'd have to go back to Mood and buy, a couple yards, and then it got expensive. I mean, it's not cheap. Also, fashion is really fickle. I'm not a fashionista, but apparently, things go in and out like that. So lace would fly off the shelf and I wouldn't see it for a while. And some laces are actually timeless, but they do make a rounds. So a pattern that's really good will show up, for a couple months in 1 year, and you have to wait a few years and then come back. But you don't know when. And I was buying the cheapest, I was buying 100% cotton because that burnt out well. And it turns out that I like it. I do prefer it for casting also, just as a better material. It's also something that I can recycle, which is nice. So I think about that. I was buying the ugliest colors, and the guy at Mood, he was just looking at me and he's, what? Wait, you're in here all the time and you're buying, what are you making? And so I showed him on my website, so I'm making these ceramic lace forms and out of ceramic, and I said, it doesn't really matter what the lace looks like. I mean, it matters the pattern, but it doesn't matter what the color is. And he just exploded. Like, he was just like, wow, this is crazy. And so he started running around looking for special laces for me, because I was very picky about it had to be a Gui Pure lace, which is a type of lace that has a lot of negative space in it. It doesn't have a backing to it because it really, I want the negative space is maybe one of the most important things in the forms that I'm making. So it was kind of a trip, but I wanted to talk also a little bit about this idea of, I don't know, the way I was taught in school. And I had other ceramic professors as well. The way that I was taught in school, I mentioned that it was very daunting for me to be in ceramics because there are a lot of rules with ceramics. And I was taught, by very, very traditional methods. And there's this idea that you have to know the rules before you know how to break them, right? Like that's kind of how I was taught, and that's kind of how I started teaching. But, I've been thinking about that a lot lately because, on a very practical level, that makes sense because, if it's technical, that's why you take a class. So you can learn the material, and you have to have limits, so you have to understand the material. Somebody's already done that work for you. They figured out, well, you can't fire clay wet, because it'll explode. And you can't do, this and that and the next thing. When it pertains to skill, however, it gets a little bit trickier and a little foggier because, it's like learning perspective when you're drawing, like you have to learn perspective before you can break the perspective. I'm probably making a lot of professors uncomfortable right now, so I can feel like this little, like, in your seat, like, wait, what are you saying? But I have to push back because, though I knew enough about ceramics to be dangerous, I didn't know all the rules, and I think that enabled me to make some discoveries about the material that I might have otherwise overlooked. And I'll tell you about an experience I had. So I had a professor who was in a show with me recently, and they were, as far as I was concerned, an absolute master in clay. And they came up to me at the opening and they said, Betsy, your forms, like, how do you make those? And it just blew me away because this guy who is, and I'm not saying that artists know how to do everything all the time. I'm not saying professors need to know everything all the time. But it just shocked me a little bit that someone wouldn't even have an idea about how I made the work that I make. And I had to think about that because a lot of the chances that I took with the work were maybe just really dumb, but I kept at it and was working with the material in a way that I think I came to it from a different perspective. And so I learned there's a way, rules are good because you learn kind of the parameters of a material, but I think sometimes those rules can stop you from doing any further investigation into the material. And so I kind of learned about ceramics in a way that is, different, I guess, than what is expected. And it just makes sense for me. And that's why I don't consider myself a straight ceramic artist because, I'm using it, I think, in a very sort of specific way and not all-encompassing. That's what works for me. So I've just poured some slip into this mold, and I'm going to let the plaster absorb the moisture. And once it absorbs, it's very shiny on the surface right now. I can't tip it because it'll all run out onto the floor. But it's very shiny right now, and when that shine goes away, I know that it's dry enough. I can put some plastic over it, and I'll leave it in there for a couple of hours. And then when it starts to come away from the sides, I'll be able to tip it out. And then I can start working with it, depending on its moisture level. So that is how I make the slabs. Yes.
Would it crack if you leave it completely dry on top of the plaster?
Yes, this, if you leave it and you don't take it out at a special time, it will crack. Yes. And that's a good question because if you've ever been to Kohler and taken the tour, if you can ever get to Sheboygan, Wisconsin, it's the sausage capital, and it also has an amazing tour at Kohler. And Kohler, by the way, has an amazing art residency and art program and a museum now. So they have an amazing collection. But you get to take a tour of their factory, and they have two factories. They have the cast iron part, and then they have the slip casting, bath, or what do they make? Toilets, and sinks. And they have these giant molds, and it's all timed. So what happens is they open these things and slip, blah, 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 pours into the mold, fills it up. Then they leave it sit, and what happens is in the mold, which is going to happen here, the plaster, depending on how dry it is, takes a certain amount of time to create a wall of a certain thickness. So if you want a 1/4 inch thickness, depending on how dry your mold is, it could be 14 minutes. It could be longer. It also depends on your clay body. So that's why you need to keep notes and keep track of the clay body you're using, how much moisture is in it, how many times you've used your mold. So if at Kohler, they have this thing where they will, after a certain amount of time, tip the mold and pour the excess out, and there's a skin in the mold. And then they let it set. So it has to still dry a little bit longer. And then the mold can be carefully removed, and that clay object can be handled and can be put somewhere. It's still wet, so it can be cleaned up and worked with. You can cut it, and you can actually hand build it, you can score it, slip it, and you can put things together. I mean, it's really kind of amazing. But the next thing is, if you want to use that mold again right away, you have to understand that that mold, the plaster has absorbed material. It has, absorbed moisture. So it's wet. It's going to take longer to absorb more moisture out of the next clay body. And so if you're using a mold in a production way, that's something you have to keep track of. And so at that point, maybe you want multiple molds if you want to make more, because you might be limited to 2 a day, and maybe as the days go on, if you keep using it, it's saturated and it's not going to work very well, and your clay body sticks, and that's not good. So what happens is when the plaster absorbs the moisture, there's actually a release. So the plaster, you don't have to do anything to the plaster. If you're casting something else in plaster, you have to use a release of some kind. But with slip, you don't. It just needs to be dry. If it's a mold you just made and it's not cured properly yet, it's not going to work. So you need to let that mold dry out enough. And with the slab molds, I just pour it to a thickness and I let the whole thing kind of dry out. I don't have to take off any excess. So it will shrink. So it's something to keep in mind. I usually make the mold, the walls around my texture, I make them the thickness that I want to start out at, and then it'll, that's how I know I poured it to a full capacity, and then it'll shrink down. And so, put this down here. I'll talk a little bit about when I make a mold. Molds are no joke, you're kind of with them all the time. You're going to have a mold for a long time. And so from an ecological standpoint, that's a bit of a downer because you don't want to create materials that you have to throw away. So the nice part about having a mold is that you can make multiples and you can use it over and over again. When? Sometimes, though, it doesn't make sense. If you're going to make, for instance, I made a mold of this object. So I do a lot of cardboard work, too. This is made out of cardboard and a little bit of wood trim. I made this for a concrete project I did at Franconia up at Schaefer, Minnesota. If you ever get up there, it's pretty awesome. But this is a capital that I made. It's totally made out of cardboard, and I sealed it with paper mache and shellac, and then I put lace on it and affixed glued lace to it, and then I made a rubber mold of it. And it got a little damaged when I pulled the rubber off, but it's pretty intact, which I kind of appreciate, so I use it as a demonstration. So I do a lot of forms that I can recycle or, out of kind of found materials. I mean, it's easy to find a cardboard box and I can turn it into the things I want to make. In fact, that's how I made the wrecking balls, is I just use balloons or balls and cardboard and paper mache and just made an object. It's kind of fun to make that stuff for me. I mean, it takes me back to like set design. So sometimes if I know I'm going to use an object more than once, sometimes slab building can be really tricky for making complex objects. Even though this one, I probably could make this in a slab, but it's a little bit tricky with this compound curve. So I opted to make this mold, and I can make multiples out of it, and this is kind of where I start. So this is cardboard and just some paper mache, and I've shellacked it. So now it's at a stage where I can put the lace on it, and that would take a little bit of time, but I'll put the lace on it and then make a plaster mold. And it's looking to me like it's going to be, actually, I could probably get away with maybe a 6-part mold, but it might end up being 8.
Question, how do you decide?
Huh?
How do you calculate how many sides you want?
Oh, that's a great question. So, like I said, you don't want to have undercuts. So, if you're imagining, first of all, that this is complex form, so if this curve, if I can get the plaster off of this, so if you imagine, if you're looking at it, trying to do this, like you can get the plaster out of this without it getting caught on something. So if I put plaster around this, it wouldn't come off, right? It would get stuck. So I have to break the sides up. Maybe I can get this whole thing off. I have to just think about it a little bit. But I also have to consider that it's going to have a texture on it, like lace. So that's going to make this curve even a little bit trickier, right? Because when I pull it out, it could get caught on some of that lace. So that's something I have to think about too. So occasionally I will break things up that I can take, one piece off and another piece comes off like that. And so it tends to just be kind of a calculated, something I have to calculate. And I really just do that by looking at the material. But the good thing is, I have to say, that because I've made this out of virtually just cardboard and paper, and the lace is pretty flexible, that does give me a little bit of flexibility when I pull the plaster mold off. If this breaks, it's not a big deal. This is going to give before the plaster does. So that's kind of a trick that I've learned to get around undercuts a little bit in the texture. And that's where I break the rules. And so I think that's pretty much it. If you have any questions or anything like that, let me know. You can see an object behind me, which is the contrapositive work that I did, and it kind of goes together with this metal and wood piece. I kind of like them together in the gallery. Contrapositive is a cast actually of an entire torso, and I elected to cast only part of it so that it could be kind of embedded in the wall. And that's just a choice I made after looking at the form and thinking, oh, I think this actually works better for my ideas. So my ideas are really, I don't really think in terms of what's the next cool thing I can make. I think in terms of what makes sense for my idea. So my ideas that I'm pushing in my work are really kind of are sometimes visceral, and thinking a lot about, again, the coincidence of fragility and strength. I mean, I think it's probably because I'm at a place right now where I'm thinking about, I don't know, mortality. People you counted on are leaving, and especially after the pandemic, just thinking about how fragile we are, like how wonderful and amazing and resilient life is. but also how fragile it is, and trying to reconciling those two things. So those are kind of the things that I think about in my work, and recently I've been thinking more also about how people are, human beings, I guess, are engaged in their environments as well, and how that relationship too is very fragile, but also very strong and resilient. So there's a lot of contradictions that I'm working with in my work, conceptually. That's a good place to end.